Medieval poverty did not start with dramatic events. It started with a cold room and the need to make the day possible. In the poorest homes, the interior was small, smoky, and built from cheap materials that leaked air and trapped soot. The first work was always about control. Sweep grit so it doesn't spread into food, gather embers so the fire doesn't die, and move water into the house because every task depends on it. The hearth was the center of everything, not for comfort but for survival math. How little fuel can be burned while still boiling, warming, and drying. Light was scarce, space was crowded, and the smell of smoke clung to rafters, cloth, and hair. A household that woke up and immediately worked was not being industrious for pride. It was preventing hunger and illness from arriving sooner. Food in these households was less a meal and more a strategy to avoid wasting calories. Bread might exist, but it was often stale and rationed, and even crumbs were collected because nothing could be replaced quickly. Porridge and thin gruel were common because grain could stretch far, and hot liquid made an empty stomach feel less empty. The pot became a place where scraps gained new value. Onion peel, wilted greens, and small herb bundles added taste and a faint sense of nourishment. Salt was precious, used sparingly to keep food edible and sometimes to preserve what little protein appeared. The daily diet depended on what could be grown, traded, or scavenged. It was rarely varied, rarely satisfying, and constantly adjusted to whatever was left in storage. Even the smallest tasks formed a chain that had to hold. If water was not hauled, there was no cooking and no washing. If embers were not protected, there was no heat for the pot and no way to dry damp cloth. If bread was wasted, the household lost tomorrow's safety net. Poverty forced a mindset where every object had a second life. Cloth became patches, scraps became broth, ash became cleaning material, and the fire was coaxed rather than fed. A poor medieval household survived by turning routine into defense. Small, repeated actions that kept a fragile home functioning from dawn onward. By midday, the poorest households shifted from immediate hunger toward producing things that prevented future hunger. The home acted like a workshop. Milk was strained because cleanliness mattered when sickness could wipe out a family's ability to work, and butter or cheese were made because they stored better than raw milk. Grain was ground by hand because buying flour cost more than time, and time was the only resource they could spend in large quantities. Baking was not just cooking, it was creating something dense and durable that could be portioned across days. Even brewing weak ale could be part of survival because safer drink mattered when water quality was uncertain, and small fermented drinks could preserve calories in liquid form. Nothing in a poor household was allowed to wear out quietly. Clothes were repaired again and again, not because repair was charming, but because new fabric was expensive and laborious to produce. Socks were darned, elbows patched, hems restitched, and leather oiled to keep straps and belts from cracking apart. Tools were sharpened because dull blades wasted effort, and wasted effort meant fewer hours for food and fuel. Clay pots were tightened and repaired because a cracked vessel could end cooking entirely. Household crafts, basket weaving, rope twisting, net mending, were not hobbies. They were replacements for purchases that could not be afforded, keeping work possible and making barter more realistic. Outside labor mirrored the same logic. Convert the landscape into usable calories. Compost was turned to keep soil productive. Chickens and pigs were fed scraps to turn leftovers into eggs and meat, and every edge of the environment offered something. Greens, mushrooms, berries, nuts, fish. Traps and snares were practical attempts to add protein without spending coin. When money appeared, it was handled with caution, counted and guarded because coins had to cover obligations that could not be ignored. Many poor families survived by barter, bringing eggs, cheese, or handmade goods to market, and accepting unequal exchanges because they needed immediate necessities more than fair value. Late in the cycle, poverty became most visible in the way obligations pressed down on households that had almost nothing to give. Rent, debt, and taxes were not abstract threats. They were moments where a family's fragile balance could collapse. A few coins might represent weeks of saving, and when coins were missing, payment could become partial and improvised. Goods offered instead of money, measured grain handed over carefully, favors owed and tracked. For the poorest families, these pressures forced constant compromise. Pay enough to avoid punishment, but keep enough to keep eating. The emotional weight of this did not always show as drama. It often showed as careful hands and tense restraint, because panic wasted energy and energy was needed for the next task. As the cold season approached, survival depended on preservation and preparation more than daily cooking. Salt curing and drying stretched small amounts of meat into longer security. Roots were stored in pits, onions braided and hung, herbs dried and saved because flavor and small medicinal benefits mattered when winter sickness spread. The house itself required maintenance like a living thing. Thatch tucked into thin spots, roof patched where water could enter, mud plaster pressed into wall cracks, drafts stuffed to keep warmth from escaping. Bedding needed fresh straw not for comfort but for insulation and hygiene, reducing damp and discouraging pests. Each action was simple, but together they formed a barrier against weather, rot, and loss. Night did not mean rest. It meant closing the system without wasting what little remained. Fleas were picked because parasites stole sleep and health. Prayer and quiet routines helped people endure uncertainty, offering structure when the future was unstable. A tallow lamp was extinguished early to conserve fuel, and the door was barred because safety mattered as much as warmth. In the poorest medieval households, the day ended the way it began, with attention to small physical realities: wood, straw, cloth, fire, salt, handled carefully, repeatedly, and without excess. Survival was not a single heroic act. It was a practiced sequence that protected the household from falling one step further.